Well, there are two reasons, I think, and they're really the same reasons we founded the Liberal Democrat History Group almost 20 years ago now. One is to help party members understand where they're coming from, what the history of the party behind them is, and their ideological and philosophical inheritance and the achievements that Liberal governments had in the past. And the second thing is really to draw that to the attention of the outside world. Certainly 20 years ago, there was much less written about the Liberal Party and the Liberal Democrats than about the other two main parties. And we wanted to make it easier and to raise the profile of liberal history and liberal ideology in the public and particularly in the academic sphere. And I think to a certain extent we've achieved that. Clearly the party is more significant now anyway, but there is much more being written and much more being studied about the Liberal Party and the Liberal Democrats than hitherto.
Now, as this race to decide the greatest Liberal in history reaches the final straight, you've got a bunch of 4 candidates that you've narrowed it down to: Gladstone, John Stuart Mill, David Lloyd George, John Maynard Keynes. What are the various attributes of each? I mean, do they each represent some different core aspect of liberalism?
Well, it's quite an interesting selection. Journal of Liberal History readers voted out of a long list of 15 back in the summer. And it's not quite what I would have expected, but it's a really good set of contrasts, and in a sense you can see the history of the Liberal Party and Lib Dems represented in the 4 of them. And you've got 2 party leaders, perhaps the greatest prime ministers the Liberal Party's produced, Gladstone and Lloyd George. Gladstone, 4 times prime minister in the 19th century, the embodiment of Victorian liberalism. Lloyd George, perhaps a more controversial figure, but key in bringing the Liberal Party into the 20th century, into the era of mass industrial democracy, with the social liberalism laid the foundations of the welfare state, helped to win the First World War, and so on. But then, on the other hand, you've got 2 people you could probably better classify as thinkers. John Stuart Mill, perhaps the greatest of the Victorian liberal philosophers, famous in particular for his work on liberty, which set out the case for individual liberty. Also, he wrote, for example, on the subjection of women, which remains the only feminist classic ever written by a man. But then again in the 20th century, and again bringing the party and bringing liberalism more up to date, John Maynard Keynes, whose economic thinking underpinned the economic theory, economic practice of Western governments for at least 3 decades.
Well, they're all obviously historical figures, and I think that the most recently deceased of them was Keynes, who died in, 1948, 1949, something like that?
46.
46. So they're all fairly historical figures. How many of them do you think would be in the Liberal Democrats today?
I think all of them would be still members of the Liberal Democrats because, clearly political philosophies and political parties change with the times. You wouldn't expect the modern Liberal Democrats to be addressing the same issues like the repeal of the Corn Laws that the Liberal Party was in the 1840s. But there is a constant thread, a constant core of belief in individual liberty and the role of government in setting the conditions to make men and women more free and to live their lives in the way they want, that I think holds Liberals together over the centuries.
Is it a bit of a worry that there's no one who's alive later than 1946 who makes the cut?
Well, we did have as one of the criteria for inclusion in the contest the fact that people had to be dead. So there were a few more modern characters like Joe Grimmond and Roy Jenkins in the long list, but they didn't make it to the short list. One of the main reasons, obviously, is that Liberals haven't been in power, sadly, at Westminster at least. Obviously, they have been in local government in Scotland and Wales, but in central government, we haven't been in power for some time. So clearly you have to go back some way to look at the people who have the greatest list of achievements. And although people like Grimmond and Jenkins were enormously important in developing modern liberalism, clearly they weren't in government very much, or at least not as Lib Dems or Liberals. So their list of achievements is rather less than, for example, Gladstone and Lloyd George.
So who's your man?
Well, I voted for Campbell Bannerman, actually, in the first ballot. Only Prime Minister for 2 years, back in 1906 to 1908, so didn't have a great achievement, but he was a superb party manager. He inherited a divided party after the collapse of Gladstonian liberalism and brought it to its greatest election victory ever in 1906. And speaking as someone who's involved in the Liberal Democrats myself, I can recognise the need for good party managers, I think. But I think my second vote went then and will go in the final round to David Lloyd George. I think Gladstone's probably the favourite. He got the most votes in the first ballot, and he's obviously an enormously impressive man. Incredible physical and intellectual energy, as well as being 4 times Prime Minister. But I think it was Churchill that said, Mr. Gladstone read Homer for fun, which I thought served him right. And I think you could probably benefit from an evening in Gladstone's company, but I think you might enjoy David Lloyd George a bit more.
And is there any politics going on around this? Is there, for example, a last-ditch campaign by members of the extended Asquith Bonham Carter family to dish David Lloyd George at the last hurdle, make sure the man who displaced their patriarch from number 10 Downing Street doesn't win the prize now?
Well, there may be. Asquith was actually a very close runner-up in the first vote, so I think there may be a bit of a grudge match going on there from the Asquith Bonham Carter family. We'll see. I mean, the final vote will be open to everybody who's at conference, Lib Dem conference in 2 weeks' time. So I expect quite intensive campaigns to be going on throughout the week, culminating our fringe meeting when we have leading historians and party figures presenting the case for each of the four.